Welcome back to the Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced. The best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. Welcome to the Season 1 finale of the Thermostat with Jason Barger. It's hard to believe that we have already reached the end of Season 1 with this podcast. Thank you to everyone out there who has subscribed to the podcast, who have rated, reviewed, commented, the feedback that we've received. Thank you for the messages that we've received about the well wishes and how much you're enjoying this podcast. So thank you to everyone out there. We've reached the end of Season 1, but we also want to make sure that we celebrate Season 1, but also get us ready for Season 2. So the one thing we know as we reach the end of this first season is that we know sometimes our brains just need a rinse and repeat. And you've heard me say this before, but it's because we all have an effing problem. We've got an effing problem in this distracted, cluttered, and busy world that we live in today. And that effing problem is we forget. We forget even the things that are most important to us, most critical to our own development, our highest priorities in this distracted, busy, cluttered world. It's easy to forget. So the best learning comes when we rinse and repeat. We rinse and repeat, and all the information, all the nuggets, all the things that we need to hold on to in our minds and hearts, we have to rinse and repeat so that we hold on to those things and keep them in the forefront of our mind and our heart. So for this episode, this recap of Season 1, let's let our minds wander back through this amazing journey we've been on this first season of the podcast. And let's allow ourselves to let our minds and our hearts travel that path, rinse and repeat, and remember the things that we want to make sure to stay with us. And then this also may jog your memory and make you think, hey, I want to go back and re-listen to that episode so that I can carry that message forward for yourself personally, for your team, your family, your organization. So let's take a little trip down memory lane and remember this first season of the Thermostat with Jason Barger. You may remember in episode 1 that I invited us all to make time for these micropods. This was the introduction to this podcast where I was inviting all of us to make time, that in a noisy, crowded, cluttered world, can we make time in our week to give us something to feed our minds and our heart and develop ourselves each week? And that the purpose of this podcast was to do just that, to provide micro podcast, short messages, themes, topics that were going to feed your mind and your heart and help you have something to think about each week, but also the longer interviews with amazing thought leaders from around the world that stimulate our own thinking. In that first episode, I shared the quote with you by Plato: "What is honored will be cultivated." What is honored will be cultivated. And I invited us, if you remember this, I invited us to think about, well, what is it that we honor? What is it that you're honoring in your life right now? What are you honoring in your work? What are you honoring your highest priorities in your life and your work in the world right now? And whatever that is that you're giving your mind, your attention, your eyes to, that's what's going to be cultivated. And it was a great episode 1 that led us into episode 2, which was that amazing and compelling. I just loved the interview that I did with Howard Behar, my great friend and mentor, the former president of Starbucks, who helped take Starbucks from 15 stores where nobody outside of Seattle knew anything about Starbucks to over 15,000 stores around the globe. And to dive into his mind and heart and listen to the way that he talks about his own leadership, to think about how do you create culture? How do they develop people at Starbucks to grow so that it wasn't about the coffee, but it was about people and the care and the kind of servant leadership. So what a fantastic discussion that Howard and I had about authentic leadership, about culture shaping at Starbucks, servant leadership, and leading in today's world. Which led us into episode 3. If you remember, where I posed the question, what does it mean to spark? What does it mean to spark? And I gave the definition. I'd been asked at a number of events to speak about this idea of sparking in the world. And I shared with you that I think what it means to spark is that when our discomfort with something in life or work, our discomfort with something in our life and work collides with the comfort of our own gifts and strengths. That collision of the two things, a spark requires two things to collide. And so if it's our discomfort with something in life and work that collides with the comfort of our own gifts and strengths, that's where a spark is created. And then from that spark, the way that we get something to grow, a relationship, a project, an idea, a business, success, whatever that is for you, the way that spark begins to grow is whether or not we choose to breathe oxygen into that spark to create flames. And that's how a spark builds into a fire and eventually a bonfire. And I pose the question, so what is it that you want to spark? And what are you going to breathe oxygen into? And in episode 4, you may remember me talking about the participatory world that we live in. I reminded us that everyone that's listening to this right now, we all live in this participatory world outside of the walls of our companies. Outside of the walls of our companies, by the way that we're moving throughout the world, the way that we are accessing information, the way that we are buying things and ordering things online, and the way that we are collaborating with the people around us, we are operating in this participatory world that I described on the podcast. And oftentimes, we're living in that world outside of the walls of our companies, but often are asked inside the walls of our companies to fall into line in some kind of old school hierarchy inside the walls. Sit in this cubicle, do these tasks, fall in line, and that the chain of command is up or down rather than this participatory world that we're actually living in right now. And so I talked about the process to engage the minds and hearts of those on your teams in order to participate in the creation of your own unique culture. And that, in fact, the best leaders, teams, and organizations in the world are not operating in this top-down old hierarchy, but they are operating in this participatory process, this participatory thermostat cultures type of process that helps everybody participate and become an ambassador for the culture you're trying to create. In episode 5, you may remember the amazing, just a wonderful interview that I did with the famous Jenny Britton Bauer from Jenny's Ice Cream. She's an eclectic, eccentric, fun, engaging person. And in this engaging interview, you may remember it's filled with stories from the rise of Jenny's Ice Creams and the challenges at Jenny's that they've experienced over the years in building their team and their culture, and then how to be authentic in the world today. It's fabulous and inspiring stuff. So if you haven't listened to that one, I make sure to get back and listen to that interview that I did with Jenny. Really, really great stuff. And then in episode 6, I shared with you the idea that we live right now in a criticulous world. Criticulous. I love that word. I'm coining that phrase, criticulous. In an often negative world, it's easy for all of us to fall into the trap of always being a critic. How easy it is today to send a comment online, to sit back behind your computer, to lob criticism into somebody. And in fact, in the world today, but also in our teams and organizations, it's easy to fall into that trap where everywhere we look, we see things through the eyes of a critic. But the best leaders and teams move from criticism into solutions, of not just being a critic to point holes in things, but actually do the work to say, how can we find solutions to make things better and to stimulate progress? In episode 7, I talked about the fact that your industry right now is changing. And in fact, the game has changed. Your game has changed. Your industry has changed. And the question isn't, is it changing? It is. I used basketball and other analogies to help, some statistics and things to help us realize that we have to know how our own game is being played today. Whatever your game is, whatever industry you're in, whatever company or business you're in, you have to know, how is the game being played today? Do you have the right skilled players? Are you playing at the right pace? Do you have the right strategy? We have to know our game that we're playing, and then we have to authentically be able to play our own game. Which led into the great episode 8 and a great, lead in to my interview with 2-time NBA world champion and Duke basketball legend Shane Battier. My great friend. It was an inspiring and unique look into the mind of a champion, somebody who's been a winner his entire life at every stage of his life and career, and what it was like to be a part of building winning teams and navigating every day with a winning mindset through life, but then also during new chapters of work and life. It's an amazing interview that I hope, if you haven't listened to, you make sure to go back and listen to that interview with Shane Battier. And then we talked about in episode 9 the fact that there is a war going on right now for our attention. There's a war. This is a noisy world that is desperately seeking our attention. We are bombarded every single day by advertisements, messages, social media posts, and certainly within the walls of our organizations, messages that get very, very noisy and crowded. And so moving from distractions and all these things that are trying to capture our attention, and moving from those distractions to gratitude and making sure that we are honoring with our sight, our focus, and our work, that which we want to cultivate. That's how we begin to win this war for our attention, to make sure that we're giving our attention to our highest priorities and to the people and to the projects and the things that we want to truly honor. In episode 10, as we moved into the holiday season, I talked about this idea of faithing. Many people on this podcast probably are, might be a person of faith, or have come from some kind of faith tradition or faith background, or you may be somebody who has really been a part of no religious or faith tradition, which is okay too. But you may be thinking, if you've ever had the thought about faith or about religion, is how do we take this belief or this thought, and how do we take it from just our thinking and a belief, and how do we enter that and put it into action? And so as we began to move through a very hectic and cluttered holiday season, my invitation and this idea of faithing, which is taking our beliefs or the things that are most important to us and putting them into action, making them a verb, is to slow ourselves down and make sure that as we hurry through the holiday season or a busy time of year, to make sure that we're slowing ourselves down and spending our time, our attention, and our efforts on what matters most. And then the very last episode before this recap, I talked about the power of hibernation. The power of hibernation, that hopefully around the new year, before you launch into the next year, and certainly as we begin season 2, we're going to be making sure that we're getting clear on the vision that's still to come, the next goals that we set, the ways in which we want to stimulate progress as leaders and in our teams and with the company that you're working for. So before we get to that, the power of hibernation, of finding times throughout our years where we're able to enter into the invitation to unplug, to allow ourselves time to reboot, to think deeply, to care deeply, and rejuvenate ourselves before starting a new year and turning our focus back to the people and the projects that we're going to be focused on in the coming year. So I hope you found time or are finding time to hibernate. And so I hope this recap of season 1 gets your mind, engages your mind and heart again, maybe reminds you of those episodes you want to go back and listen to again, but also gives you that vision for the content and the flow the conversation that we've been on to date, and hopefully gets you even more excited about what's yet to come in season 2. But I want to make sure that I give us some reflection questions for this episode. And these reflection questions, like we do with every episode in the podcast, I try to give you some things for you to think about to engage your mind and your heart on this next week or whenever you're listening to this podcast. But for this finale episode, these questions, these reflection questions, actually came in from listeners from this season. Some things for us all to step back and to ponder this week. So let's dive into about 4 questions that came in about season 1 of the Thermostat with Jason Barger. Question 1 came, which of your books will help me develop my own leadership philosophy and help with building the culture of my team at work? This was a question came in from somebody saying, which of my books will help this person develop their own leadership philosophy and help with building the culture of their team at work? Well, this is kind of like asking me which child of mine do I like best. I love all of my children. They're unique. They're wonderful. And so asking me which of my books do I like best or will help you develop your own leadership philosophy or help you with your culture work, the thing I'll say is let me just focus for a second on the purpose of each book. That all are about continuing a conversation. And so actually each of my books build upon the other. And so they all play a role in the conversation. But let me talk about the purpose of each of the books. In my first book, Step Back from the Baggage Claim, that was a journey that I went on, 7 days in 7 airports to live in airports across the United States. And it was really about a personal journey of stepping back. And I think anyone reading it can relate to their own journey, but it's about a personal reflection on stepping back and thinking about how do you move throughout the world? Why are you doing what you do? And the impact that you can make right where you are on the people around you. And so Step Back is really an introduction into personal leadership and thinking about how you move throughout the world every single day. My second book, Remember, is about what are those cognitive things, those things in our brains and in our memories in the midst of a busy and distracting world. What are those things that we want to try to remember or we need to remember every single day? And remembering our highest priorities and making sure that we are renewing. The reason why it's called Remember is once we remember cognitively what's most important to us, why we do what we do, who we're wanting to be in the world, what we're trying to accomplish, then the best leaders, teams, and organizations are the ones that renew those commitments. They remember. They renew the memberships of the people in their life, the relationships, the priorities, and the visions for their life moving forward. And then, lastly, my most recent book, Thermostat Cultures. This is about the proactive process to shape the culture with people and the teams and the organization that you serve. So from your own personal leadership, how do teams and organizations proactively shape the culture they want? Not just the culture they have, but the culture they want. So how do we do it? And how do we begin to participate in that proactive process? So all of the books fit together. I hope that's helpful to you. But all of them are continuing that conversation from personal leadership into creating that culture within your team or your organization. Another question that came in said, which episode in season 1 was your favorite, was my personal favorite, and why? Again, this one's hard to answer. I loved all of the episodes. I think, again, they all continue a conversation. But I really loved all of the interviews that I was lucky to get to do. What powerful people. When I think back about Howard Behar from Starbucks, Shane Battier, NBA champion, Jenny Britton Bauer, Jenny's Ice Creams, what powerful people and examples and great synergy with me and my messages. And these are people who inspire me. So these are just great examples of work that me and my company are doing with organizations. And what a great examples of this kind of developing leaders and culture that you can see examples from other thought leaders from around the world. I also loved the micropod style of season 1. I really think these shorter micropods that we've been doing, we've been getting great feedback about, and those are some of my favorite nuggets. Some of my favorite from season 1 was the idea of sparking and breathing oxygen. How do we breathe oxygen into the things that matter most to us? Talking about how the game changed. I love that micropod about how is the industry and our companies and how is the game changing. I love the idea about the criticulous world that we live in and how easy it is to fall into the trap of being a critic. And yet we live in a participatory world. And so don't participate in criticism, but what is it like and what does it mean to be a person that's solutions focused, solutions oriented? So those are some of the big ideas that certainly inspired me in season 1. Another question that came in says, do you believe speeches make a difference to companies or teams? They're asking me personally, do I believe that speeches make a difference to companies or teams? And in this question, I can see that they're also, in parentheses, they say that they know they do, but they wanted to see what my thought was on this. So let me just say this, because I actually get this question a good amount, because people that, how does a speech really make a difference? And what I'll say to this, this is my own reaction and my feeling at the core of my being. Yes. Yes, they do. I couldn't be somebody who gives. I think I gave around 70 keynote speeches last year, and I couldn't give speeches if I didn't feel like they truly made a difference. I don't want to just be a speaker guy. I want to be someone who truly connects and resonates and adds value to people. So I, of course, know that they don't solve everything. A speech, you don't solve, it doesn't solve everything. But who hasn't been in a room of a great speech, or that moment in a locker room or with a coach or a teacher or a boss, where someone important in you said something that moved you to become better? Who hasn't experienced this? Because if you haven't, then maybe you wouldn't know the power of that. But for everybody who has, the power of being in those environments where, as I like to think about it, speeches are a planting of seeds. They spark engagement of the mind and heart, and they lead us to the next work, which I also love, which is beyond the speech, which is the watering of the seeds, which is why I'm lucky that I have clients who I love working with over time, that I have clients that I'm on a year or longer agreement with, where not only are we kicking off and helping to spark ideas and to plant those seeds in speeches, but also we're carrying that development and we're watering the seeds and working with them over time to water, to implement, to grow the seeds of leadership and culture in their organization. So, do speeches make a difference? Absolutely. And then what you do with them and how you continue the conversation is where those seeds begin to grow and develop in your culture. All right, and the last question that came in was this. The person prefaced it and said, I love the podcast, but they're interested in why Jason Barger thinks people should listen to this podcast. So they're saying they love the podcast, but they're interested in my perspective of, why should people listen to this podcast? Which, wow. Thank you first for liking the podcast, but thanks. That's a great question. I guess my answer would be this. Why do I think people should listen to this podcast? First thing I'll say is this. I know how busy we all are. Again, you've heard me say this over and over again. We live in a busy, cluttered, distracted time. I know that. I know how valuable your time is. I know that you are bombarded by messages all the time. But I also know this. I know I'm better at being me. I'm a better husband. I'm a better father. I'm a better friend. And yes, absolutely, I'm better at the work that I'm lucky to do in the world when my mind and my heart are engaged and I'm focused week by week by week. So my hope with this podcast is that this is a place where people can be engaged and that the thought, the content, the topic, the questions nudge all of us, nudge us forward and spark progress in your week, in your life, in your work. I hope it stimulates progress for you. That's the big hope, and that's why I do this. And fortunately, we've been getting great feedback, but I hope you continue to listen, and I hope it is that place for you that nudges you forward. So, we've come to the end of season 1. It's been an engaging season 1, and I hope you're ready to also dive into season 2 in the new year. The new season will be coming out in the new year. I hope you enjoy a wonderful holiday season, and I hope you share this podcast with others. Please, thank you for all the people that are rating and reviewing and subscribing, all that stuff. It's so helpful to us as we continue to try to amplify these positive messages in the world. But also, I hope that you'll reflect back on these episodes over the month of December or whenever you're listening to this, and remember that what we honor will be cultivated. So what will you honor in the coming days, in the coming weeks, and the year ahead? Keep listening. Keep joining the conversation. Remember that where you look is where you go. And thank you for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using. And share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to your organization, or you have a question or comment about this podcast, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we all are ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.